Hi, you've reached S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. Every so often, we encounter some incredible people on the internet. Aron Ra is somebody who's been making a lot of traction for the atheist community, and very few people have stood up to him in debates. I happened upon a particular debate with a person who's called Mike Jones, and he's with Inspiring Philosophy, and I think Mike Jones made some really good arguments against Aron Ra. In fact, he's been shaking grounds with all kinds of atheists. And so this video is going to show you a lot of the great rebuttals from Michael Jones. And why am I wearing sunglasses? Because the light is shining so bright, one must wear sunglasses. Let's go. Ready? Stay tuned.
Faith is not just a synonym of trust. It's a belief that is based on logical fallacies, arguments from authority, or subjective impressions, anything but scientific evidence. It's just a question about how much scientific evidence you reject. Are you a geocentric young earth creationist who believes the earth is flat, just like the Bible says, no matter what the facts are? Or do you accept evolution as long as you can imagine that it is guided by God? In either case, at least you don't speak in tongues while drinking Drano and dancing with poisonous snakes, because you probably already know that even if you had enough faith to fill a mountain, it still wouldn't move a mustard seed. Even the slightest acceptance of Christianity still requires some denial of natural science, even if it's just making believe things that are not evidently or even possibly true, like the soul, for example, because you have to believe that, or else you'll face the empty threat of a fate worse than death if you don't make yourself believe. There's a definite danger to your ability to reason if you've been conditioned that you must believe man-made mythology of impossible absurdity, and for no good reason, even when all the evidence says otherwise. Christianity is dangerous to children because they're told that they're born defective and need to ask forgiveness for even being born at all, and that they'd better not think rationally about that or they'll burn in hell. Intellectually damaging child abuse. We've seen hundreds of children die in this country because their parents prayed over them but denied them medicine for easily treatable ailments. These kids all died because their parents were effectively wishing on a star, hoping for a magical enchantment that was never going to make their wish come true. Religious extremists have a distorted view of family values, where you're supposed to hold your pretend relationship with your magic imaginary friend above the real relationships that you have with your spouse, your parents, or even your children. Because remember, Jesus said in Matthew 10 that you cannot follow him unless you hate your sister and your brother and your father and your mother and your wife and even your own life. Call no one father on earth, he said, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. So forget about those people who really should matter more by virtue of the fact that they're really there, and you don't have to pretend that they are. The cornerstone of most extreme religious right conservative Christians is the abortion issue, misrepresented as though it was ever about killing babies, ignoring, of course, that chapter 5 of the book of Numbers allows abortion with God's direct approval and involvement, even for the trivial reason of suspicion of infidelity. Yet with recent comments by Clyde Chambliss, sponsor of the Alabama abortion bill, we now have an admission that it's not about the life of the fertilized embryo, not in a laboratory setting, because he said that doesn't count as a baby, nor even a life, unless it's inside the mother. Anti-abortion bills are not pro-life, they're anti-woman, designed to deny them control of their own reproduction. Then there's the issue of morality. Statistically, there's a negative correlation between religiosity and what we typically think of as moral behavior. I have lists of studies showing that the most religious countries, especially those that are historically predominantly Christian, also tend to have the highest murder rate, and the same is true of most religious areas within the United States, with special emphasis on hate crimes. Secular nations show the opposite tendencies, where the less religious they are, the more peaceful they tend to be. According to sociology professor Phil Zuckerman, it is the highly secularized countries that tend to fare the best in terms of crime rates, prosperity, equality, freedom, democracy, women's rights, human rights, educational attainment, and life expectancy, although there are exceptions such as Vietnam and China, which have famously poor human rights records. And those nations with the highest rates of religiosity tend to be the most problem-ridden in terms of high violent crime rates, high infant mortality rates, high poverty rates, and high rates of corruption. Here in America, evangelical Christians are more likely to condone the murder or torture of prisoners, where non-religious people are more likely to consider that morally wrong. Evangelicals also have the highest divorce rate and the highest rates of teen pregnancy. Here in Texas, we still have the highest rates of repeat teen pregnancy because we used to teach abstinence only in place of sex education. Fundamentalist Christians even have a higher rate of abortions, a testament to their hypocrisy. But it gets even worse than that. Child Protective Services and other agencies report a significant majority of abusers and molesters identify as very religious, and the more religious they are, the worse offenders they are, with more sexual offense convictions against more and younger victims. Yet, believers argue that the less religious we are, the less moral we are. The studies, the polls, the history do not support their claim. Even second-hand Christianity is dangerous to everyone, because now that the Republican Party is almost entirely evangelical and under the control of the fossil fuel industry, personified by the Koch brothers, the religious right cannot admit the impact of our industries on the environment without hurting profits in the next fiscal quarter. So the Texas Republican Party platform says that anthropogenic climate change must be treated as a questionable theory, not to be accepted or believed, no matter what the cost of denying this reality will be to our planet and the future of our species. Christianity is definitely dangerous, even in small doses.
Another hand for Aron. Our second speaker almost won the longest distance traveled, but there's a man in the back that drove here from Colorado. So, I'm sorry, he flew from Colorado. He traveled from. There you go. Anyone further than Colorado, we'll give you a free beer mug. All right. Our second speaker is Michael Jones. He's a Christian apologist and the founder and president of Inspiring Philosophy Ministries, an organization that is building a video library for every apologetic topic out there. Michael creates videos that defend the biblical worldview and corrects misinformation among Christians. Speaking to the topic, Is Christianity Dangerous? Please welcome Michael Jones.
They need to give us an extra minute to set up.
I know. Let me get my timer. Good evening. Well, I have been looking forward to this for months, and I'd like to thank Aron Ra for agreeing to the debate and the Bible and Beer Consultorium for hosting tonight. I'd also like to thank James Kunz in the back for helping fund my trip here. And I'd also like to thank the channel Rational Perspectives, formerly known as DREST 83, for helping me prep for tonight. And with that out of the way, I want to dive right in. There seems to be some confusion about the topic of tonight. The topic is not, are Christians dangerous? If that was the topic tonight, in one sense, many Christians would probably say yes, because our own Bible says all humans are sinful, depraved, and that we seek to fill our own selfish desires. And that is the reason we need Christianity. So in one sense, I'm sure plenty of Christians would agree, yeah, at times Christians can be dangerous. In another sense, Aron might have to admit Christians are not dangerous because he felt safe to come to tonight's event, and I don't see a bulletproof vest on him. But that is not the topic tonight. The topic tonight is Christianity dangerous? Aron has listed several examples of Christians and some people who are not Christians who have done bad things. He only had to sit in one church service to know that Christians sin every day. Aron has agreed to debate the affirmative tonight, so he has to show that Christianity necessarily is the cause of these bad things that Christians have done, and I will argue this cannot be demonstrated. From watching numerous of Aron's past debates, including one of his recent debates with Tyler Vela, he has attempted to argue certain core tenets of Christianity have dangerous effects. And he has argued that the promotion of faith in the Bible causes people to become less rational or intelligent, in so many of his own words. From viewing numerous of his lectures, his reasoning seems to be Bible verse says X, Aron interpret X to mean Y, and most Christians probably also or must interpret X to mean Y, and Y has dangerous effects. So, for example, Aron reads a verse that encourages faith among Christians. Okay? Aron then interprets this verse to mean rejecting evidence and reason and believing blindly, and most Christians probably or must think this way, and this has horrible consequences in society. I will argue none of these can be demonstrated. They're all leaps in logic, and they're completely unjustified. Many of Aron's attempts to argue, or many of his attempts to interpret scripture passages are based on a misunderstanding of the context. And even if he is right in his interpretation, there is no statistical evidence the majority of Christians agree with him or even have to. On top of that, he has to show empirically that this leads to negative results in society. Random examples from his experience or from the media or the news don't demonstrate that. I could find numerous examples of atheists, feminists, or humanists doing bad things, but it would be absurd for me to make the leap in logic and say this means atheism or humanism caused these bad things. So, for example, there is one study out there called Mentalizing Defects Constrain Belief in a Personal God, which shows an association between atheism and autism. But it would be ridiculous for me to suggest atheism somehow causes autism. In psychology, this is called an attribution error, when you unjustifiably attribute an effect to something. By Aron listing examples of Christians doing bad things, this is actually not proof Christianity caused these bad things. One researcher in his paper, To Err in Their Ways, the Attribution Bias of New Atheists, has specifically called out new atheists for committing this fallacious reasoning quite often. So a lot of the arguments Aron made can be pointed out as nothing more than attribution errors. He has to demonstrate for us that Christianity, as a form of intrinsic religiosity, is the direct cause of these alleged harmful effects. Now I could go through and list a bunch of nice Bible verses or list a bunch of nice things Christians have done, but Aron and I would be talking past one another. Therefore, I propose an area of mutual agreement. Science. Because the fact remains that numerous psychologists and social scientists have looked into this subject to see if Christianity, which is a form of intrinsic religiosity, does correlate with negative social behaviors or lower quality of life. And the overwhelming consensus in scientific literature is resounding no. In fact, numerous studies show intrinsic religiosity does increase one's overall quality of life and has been positively associated with increased ethical behavior and overall well-being. Now, there will always be exceptions to the rule. Some studies do show religiosity is associated with various negative effects. But by and large, the consensus in peer-reviewed literature is intrinsic religiosity not only is not dangerous, but that is associated with beneficial results in multiple ways. Some studies even cite a causal relationship, and I'll note some of them. I'll mainly focus on meta-analyses, which take into account all the studies published on a particular topic to see what the general trend is. So there's one study, If You Love Me, Keep My Commandments, a meta-analysis of the effects of religion on crime, which looked at 60 individual studies and found that intrinsic religiosity is a deterrent for crime. The average effect size was 0.12. Another study, Religion, Spirituality, and Physical Health in Cancer Patients, a meta-analysis, found religion was associated with the physical health of cancer patients, functional well-being, and improved physical symptoms. Another paper from 1997, the Religious Orientation Scale, Review and Meta-Analysis of the Social Desirability Effects, found intrinsic religiosity, and I quote, tends to correlate with desirable variables: mental health, altruism, religious commitment, and extrinsic religiosity correlates with that which is undesirable: prejudice, non-marital sex. Another study from 2015, Religion, Delinquency, and Drug Use, a meta-analysis, found religion had an inverse correlation with delinquency and drug use. Another meta-analysis from 2003, Religiosity and Mental Health, a meta-analysis of recent studies, analyzed 34 studies and found aspects of intrinsic religiosity were associated with better mental health and found strong correlations between religiosity and mental health. In 2001, a study titled Religion and Mental Health, Evidence for an Association, surveyed 850 studies and found that, and I quote, religious involvement is generally associated with greater well-being, less depression and anxiety, greater social support, and less substance abuse. Another meta-analysis, religious priming, a meta-analysis with a focus on prosociality, found that religious priming has robust effects across a variety of outcomes, including prosocial effects. These studies I just cited are meta-analyses, which again take into account numerous studies which have differing results. They collect the data, do a mathematical analysis to find the general trend, thus making their conclusions far more reliable. Now, I swear, I could spend the rest of my time going over study after study after study. There is a wealth of information on this topic, by and large, that demonstrates that there are positive associations and sometimes causation with intrinsic religiosity. To claim that Christianity is dangerous, one has to tear down all of these studies and present their own studies that argue Christianity as a form of intrinsic religiosity does have dangerous effects. And as far as I can see from the peer-reviewed literature, that claim is scientifically unwarranted. So, as Aron Ra said in his opening statements of 2018 with George Lujak, my position it is dishonest to assert blind speculations as though they were fact. But that is all religions do, and science is only concerned with what is supported by evidence, and what is not supported by the evidence. And what is not supported by the evidence does not warrant serious consideration. Come back when you have something to show, and then we'll have something to talk about.
Let the lobster battle begin.
Yeah, I see. From my perspective, like for today, in today's day and time, if I'm picking up a history book and it doesn't have who wrote it, doesn't have when it was written, doesn't have where it was written, for example, it doesn't say where the sources came from, doesn't even critique the sources, I would trust that book, that history book, less than a book that has all those things.
Well, I mean, you're not going to find that in the ancient world.
Yes, you're right. You're not, or at least very rarely. But now here's my question for you. Why lower your standards just for Jesus? Like why, if we have the standard of history today, and we had this amazing, incredible claim back then, should we lower our standards and say, well, we shouldn't expect that for that time, so we give it a pass? Like, should we give it a pass?
No. I don't give it a pass. I would say it has to depend on the evidence. So when we do historical criteria, we have to find 5 things. An explanation has to have explanatory scope, explanatory power, has to be the least ad hoc, it has to be the most plausible, and then it has to provide illumination in other areas. So I basically put that forward when people present historical cases in a lot of areas. So if you want to say maybe Vespasian, the Emperor Vespasian really did a miracle, really did heal a blind person, I'd put that into the historical criteria. And so I would judge it the same way I would try to judge the resurrection argument.
But there are some, at least a few historians back in that day who did identify themselves and when they wrote and where they wrote it, right?
Yeah.
Can you give an example? Is it Dionysius?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he does. I think Lucian does as well, but I'd have to check. It's been a while since I've looked at a lot of those guys, so I can't remember exactly everyone who does that. But a lot of them don't.
So if we were looking at 2 pieces of a historical test, would you put more confidence in author, even back then, who cites his sources, gives his name, where he wrote, when he wrote? Would you be more confident in that history book than one that none of that's said?
No, because just telling me who you are doesn't make your claims more valid.
Well, in his sources, he critiques the sources, gives his sources.
Okay, so what if his sources are a bunch of Roman mythology? That's not going to make me believe it.
Me personally, I am a minimal mythicist, kind of how Richard Carrier would explain it, in that, I don't believe in the fringe theories that are obviously out there, but I believe that Jesus probably didn't exist considering a whole lot of factors. And actually, IP diffused me a little bit tonight because I was watching his content this week as well, a lot actually, and I kind of expected him to use the New Testament as a source. No, I know, but you do have several videos where you argue for the reliability of the New Testament, and you seem to have used those a lot. But you also have external sources that you also backed up as well, which, like tonight, you have said that you were going to use primarily Tacitus and Josephus, and you would be correct in that I disagree that those definitively prove that Jesus existed in history. Now, like it's like I said before, I am a minimal mythicist, so that means that I believe that Jewish sects in the first century came up with this idea of a Messiah figure, and what they did was they adapted what they knew from the Jewish scriptures, which would be like the Septuagint and other documents that they had. They adapted prophecies that they perceived to be about Jesus and create this Messiah figure. And using the Gospels and Paul, I can make a solid case for that. But since we're not really covering that yet, I will skip that entire section. I'll go directly to the external sources that IP says that he wants to use. But if we want to later have a conversation over the Gospels and Paul's tradition, then we can definitely have that conversation. So IP here has claimed Tacitus, and I actually do also have a part of it written down as well. Nero looked for a scapegoat and inflicted the most fiendish tortures on a group of persons already hated for their crimes. This was the sect known as Christians. Their founder, one Christus, it actually does not in the original have an I or an E. It's CHR, no vowel, and STUS. Have been put to death by the procurator Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. This checked the abominable superstition for a while, but it broke out again and spread not merely through Judea, where it originated, but even to Rome itself, the great reservoir and collecting ground from every kind of depravity and filth. Those who confessed to being Christians were at once arrested, but on their testimony, a great crowd of people were convicted, and not so much on charge of arson, but on hatred of the human race. Now, if we were to take this passage at face value and assume that it was actually talking about Christians or Christ in general, then they would literally be just repeating information that was already being circulated at the time. Generally, when I come at the historicity side of this, I try to use three factors to judge whether or not something is good historically, as good historical proof. Those three factors are time, independence, and explanatory power. So this would violate the independence factor because you have Paul that's writing in the 50s about Christ, this Christ myth. And so at this point in time, I mean, it wouldn't be firsthand account information. It wouldn't be any kind of information that we could actually link to a person like on Earth. This would just be Christians in general and not any kind of form of a Christ thing. Christians, even at the very start of their cult, they loved persecution narratives. So Tacitus isn't really based on an independent source, but there is a reason to doubt the validity of the passage. For one thing, there's no other historian that wrote about the burning of Rome and attributing it to the Christians. The apocryphal Acts of Paul was written around 160 CE. Doesn't mention the Christians being persecuted by Nero for the burning of Rome. That piece of literature has Nero burning Christians around Paul's death, so it kind of seems like they would mention him blaming the Christians for the burning of Rome. The Acts of Peter, written in the late 2nd century, claims that Nero considered destroying Christians, but was scared by a dream. The first time after Tacitus... the first time after Tacitus that was persecuting Christians in Rome was mentioned is by Sulpicius Severus, who, by the way, sounds like a Harry Potter villain, around 400 CE. And then there were historians that were actually in Rome that also neglected to mention this tidbit of information about blaming the Christians. Josephus and Pliny the Elder failed to mention the Christians being blamed for the burning of Rome. According to Seneca the Younger's lost work called On Superstition, Seneca didn't even mention Christianity at all. And he was actually lambasted later on by apologists for that. That's why it's a lost work, because we only have references to it later on. And then there's a number of different reasons that was actually given by Evan Remsburg in 1909. For one thing, this particular portion is not quoted by any Christian fathers in the first century or so. Tertullian was familiar with the writings of Tacitus, and his arguments demanded the citation of this evidence had it existed. Clement of Rome at the beginning of the 3rd century made a compilation of all the recognitions of Christ and Christianity that had been made by pagan writers up to his time. The writings of Tacitus furnish no recognition for them. Origen, in his controversy of Celsus, would undoubtedly have used it if it had existed. The ecclesiastical historian Eusebius in the 4th century cites all the evidences, or all of the evidence of Christianity obtainable by Jewish and pagan sources, and makes no mention of this portion of Tacitus. It's not quoted by any Christian prior to the 15th century, although we find it in the 400 CE by Sulpicius Severus. So I mean, there's more points that I can make here about why it's a little suspicious, but still, even if we were to disregard my problems with the verse and how, or with this section and how, it's not really mentioned by anybody else, that doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't happen or anything like that. That's why I tried to focus first on the fact that if it is authentic, that's fine, but it doesn't actually place Jesus here on earth.
All right, and that's a lot to take in, by the way. So, I mean, I hope you're taking some notes on that one.
Oh yeah, I wrote that.
So we're going to give you just as much equal time to respond and have a rebuttal to everything, if possible, or at least some things that Jihi had thrown out there.
First thing I'll do is I want to share my screen here. So let's go to this. This is actually can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, good. This is actually the passage in Tacitus from the 11th century manuscript. Now, G.E. said there's no I or E in Christos in this passage. So I luckily got a photocopy. We can zoom in, 7th line down. There's the word Christos, Christos. We know this is an I here, this slant here, because if you look over here in the next word, that's the word Tiberio. And you see the R and, oops, sorry about that. Let me go back to where I was. You can see the R and the I here is the same in Christos. It's an R and an I. The actual R and the I is in there. He does say Christos. I think what you did is you maybe read something off Rational Wiki and got a little confused. There is actually a textual variant. It's in the line above. There is no I in the word Christianos right above that. As you can see, there is the R, but there is no slant, the word directly right above that. And that's because we think the original word there was Christians, which is not really an issue. We have dozens of manuscripts and actual funeral inscriptions from the first couple centuries of Christianity, which do refer to themselves as Christians. So I can stop sharing my screen now. Let's see. Stop sharing screen. Okay. So yeah, that's the actual manuscript. It's available online. Anyone can go see the photocopies. It does have the I. It does say Christos. So that's actually there. A lot of also what you said was a lot of arguing from silence, and that exactly does not necessarily work in history. For example, all of our sources regarding Alexander the Great were written 300 years after he existed, starting with Diodorus. Then we have Quintillus Curtius, Arrian, and Plutarch. This is long after, and historians don't really use arguments from silence like that for that very reason. I can pull up dozens of examples of arguments from silence, more like Marco Polo going to China, not mentioning the Great Wall or the Great Tea Districts. Ramesses II fought a great battle against the Hittite Empire in Megiddo. We have dug there. We have found no archaeological evidence of a battle that was ever fought there during the late Bronze Age. So arguments from silence simply do not work when it comes to historical investigation. As for regards of no early church father quoting this passage, they have no reason to. Tacitus is a hostile witness, as I said. It's not going to support someone like Origen, who's trying to respond to Celsus. Celsus didn't doubt that Jesus existed. He talks about Jesus' mother, Jesus' birth, Jesus dying on the cross, Jesus basically being a person. We have no evidence of Christ mythos existing for the first 1,700 years of Christianity's existence. So that simply doesn't work. As even Jeff Lauder, one of the co-founders of infidels.org, noted, this has no apologetic merit for someone trying to argue for the resurrection or theology of Christianity. So, and as regards to Christians being persecuted in Rome, actually, Tacitus, yes, is the only source that blames it for the Christians, but Suetonius, for example, also mentions that Nero was persecuting Christians. So in Nero chapter 16 of his 12 Lives of the Caesar, he says he likewise inflicted punishments on the Christians
a sort of people who were held for new and impious superstition. So we actually do see that in there as well. So in regards to Clement of Rome and Eusebius, I'd like to know where actually you're getting that from. Remsburg has been really highly disputed. I don't actually, when I've read I'm sorry, you said Clement of Alexandria, I believe. Clement of Alexandria or nor Eusebius were saying they were compiling an exhaustive list of all of the sources of Christianity. They weren't responding to Christ myths. They had no need to do that. And even if that's the case, that doesn't necessarily mean Tacitus was wrong. Historians like Ronald Syme, Michael Grant, Donald Martin, D.F. Chilver note Tacitus is one of the most reliable historians from the ancient world, especially from that era. Ronald Syme says, the prime quality of Cornelius Tacitus is distrust. It was needed if a man were to write about the Caesars. Tacitus was extremely skeptical. Anytime he doubted a passage, he wondered if it was wrong, he told us. He would say, I don't know if this is accurate. Like, for example, just before this passage, he talks about there was a conspiracy to assassinate Nero, and he says, I'm not sure where this originated from. Just after this passage, I believe in section 53, he gives you a quote from Pliny, and he says it's absurd, but I felt it best to tell you anyway. So Tacitus would always tell us when he was skeptical of something. When I emailed Ronald Meller this week, I asked him about a lot of this stuff, and he said he thought Tacitus, based on this passage, would likely have been referring to earlier Roman sources based on how it reads, based on the linguistic style. Tacitus, in this one passage, doesn't bring up any skepticism. He doesn't even make any notice of Christian sources, mind you. He doesn't even seem any familiarity with Christian or Jewish sources through any of his writings. I don't know of many scholars who try to argue he was basically getting his information from that. So I think I responded to everything. Regarding this passage with Josephus, Josephus leaves a lot of holes in his work. For example, Suetonius mentions how the Jews were expelled by Claudius. Josephus is supposed to be writing a history of the Jews. He doesn't mention that. So that's not necessarily – so again, Josephus is called a patchwork author. He leaves a lot of holes in his history. And just because he didn't mention it, again, that would just be an argument from silence. And it doesn't show the actual passage in Tacitus is wrong.
William Wallace.
Can't be. Not tall enough.
The Almighty says this must be a fashionable fight. It's drawn the finest people. Where is thy salute for presenting yourselves on this battlefield?
My cognitive faculties are telling me that there really are moral facts and duties. There really are these things, objective things that are independent of me. I don't just get to make them up. Like I can change my taste preferences or I can change my favorite movie or anything like that. I mean, why would we then therefore assume that they're like that if they're manifesting in reality an objective sense that requires justice, that brings about moral convergence and moral progress? Why ought we doubt our moral intuitions when they're manifesting in a way that appears to be objective?
I don't agree with you. I don't think they are manifesting in a way that they're objective, and I don't think they're doing it in a way that there's moral progress either.
Okay, so then how do they manifest then?
I don't know how they manifest to you. You're the one with that position.
Are you an epistemic skeptic?
Huh?
Are you an epistemic skeptic?
I don't know what that means. Epistemic. I mean, it's
skeptic sort of like I can't have knowledge. It's sort of like I just can't have knowledge. I can't know.
No, I think you can know things. Sure.
Okay, so then we can at least reasonably conclude that we are sort of on the same. Both have human brains. We're both on the same.
Yeah. I'm talking about specifically morality, though, and your claim that there are moral facts and they are there regardless of human minds existing.
So you don't think you have moral intuitions that things are actually evil and good?
No, I think I have morality built on emotions and my experience, but mostly emotions and empathy.
So
I don't have to intuit I don't know if I'd use the word intuition.
So okay, so then basically you have emotions or feelings So if you were to, see someone being tortured, you'd want to stop it just based on your feelings, though.
Sure.
So then you are aware of like something like the Freech-Gandhi problem, then, right?
I'm not. Please explain it.
Okay. Well, I went over my video on non-cognitivism.
Yeah, I watched a lot of videos today. I'm sorry, man. I may not remember all of them.
Okay, so you would say that something like, I don't, it's wrong. If I said it's wrong to murder, you would say that's a non-cognitive state, right?
What do you mean non-cognitive state?
Well, you said you're kind of leaning towards the idea they're emotions or feelings.
So yeah, I'm not. I'm kind of on the fence. Like I said, I'm still kind of really at the place where I think that it's more moral subjectivism. But that's what I'm trying to. I'm trying to get your position, because you're trying to argue that I'm wrong, but you're not giving me a better alternative to argue for. I'm not really. All I'm doing is countering your points. I asked you to make an argument for it, and I haven't quite heard that argument. Besides saying that you believe in intuition, and intuition tells you that there are moral facts. But that's the most I've heard of your argument so far.
Again, I started with intuitions. I started arguing from atheistic philosophers that started that. I gave moral progress, moral convergence, the way they actually manifest in reality. And you're saying, no, that's not, and I want to know the better alternative.
Well, the problem is you've just made assertions. Like, there hasn't been an actual argument. You just said intuitions. Then you said the way they manifest in reality, which I don't grant you that. You talked about moral progress, which I don't grant you that. So, like, I don't know where the argument is. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just simply trying to counter your points. Like I said, I'm open to change my mind. I just want to hear the argument that proves that moral facts exist outside of human minds.
What's the issue with moral progress then?
Because basically, if I were to say things are getting better, it's basically just pure, like, based on a standard that I have subjectively through my emotions and opinions created. Okay, so like you're when you say moral progress, you're appealing to some kind of standard, like ultimate standard, and the progress is as morality evolves in our cultures. I don't know if this might be the best word to use there, but as morality changes, it's getting more towards that ultimate goal, that standard, right? But and that ultimately that standard is going to be God for you as a Christian. But I know we're not quite there yet.
So you say there really is no standard. So then why is it? So then would you agree that, like, society is better off without crucifixion, without rape, without murder?
It's my opinion that society would be better if there was no rape or crucifixion.
So why would society be better without rape?
People wouldn't be harmed and hurt.
Is harm necessarily a bad thing then?
It's my opinion that it's bad, yeah. And I feel empathy. I feel empathy for people who are harmed. So therefore, I don't want them to be harmed.
So basically, you're non-cognitive then. It's just your feelings then.
I think, like I said, I lean a little bit that way. I do.
Okay, then let's get back to the Freech-Gandhi problem, because you kind of jumped off of that and then you went back. And so if I said it's wrong to murder, you would say that can't be true or false.
Correct. Yeah,
okay,
Okay. So is religion a positive influence on society? Yes. I was.
All right, let's go home now. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, people.
I think it's easy to say yes for anything like this. The issue is it a net positive? I mean, because my primary concern is not whether or not religion can be a positive effect or can have positive effects on society. It's whether or not it's true. But when we talk about whether or not religion has positive effects, it would be very easy for each of us to sit here and cite different studies. I can go back to the Journal of Religion and Science study that I've been referencing from Gregory S. Paul for years that shows that on every major societal factor, it's negatively correlated with increased religiosity. And when we talk about things like, the crime rate there, I would agree with Mike that there are atheists. I don't really use the new atheist label, but there are certainly atheists who like to quote about, how underrepresented atheists are in prison and all these other things. I think there may be an attribution error in the studies as well, in the other direction, because if someone who reports that they are more religious is less likely to commit a crime, how do we know that religiosity is in fact the motivating thing there? How do we know that it's not having a good family structure, a good social structure, a good community that you're living in, where it's true that churches build communities. They also build hospitals and universities. They do things to help the homeless and other things. And those are certainly positive effects. My view is that those are positive effects of caring people, and they may credit it to their religion. I don't necessarily see that the religion itself is properly attributed as the thing that is doing good. Because when I look at the broader interactions that we have in society, oh, religion's built hospitals. Yes, but you can build hospitals without religion. And when you have religious hospitals, what you find quite often is that in many Catholic hospitals, for example, they have their religious doctrine trump medical science. And so you'll wind up with a woman who's not a Catholic who has a miscarriage, and then they force her to come in and have a funeral, not just for the miscarriage, but for the afterbirth as well, because that's birth material. And this is potentially traumatic. When we talk about religiosity and mental health, the societal influences, the having a community, having people who support you, certainly that is good for mental health. But having doctrines about demon possession, having doctrines that make people view themselves and who they are and who they're born with, oh, I was gay, I'm trans, whatever, and religion says that I was wrong and born wrong, that can be incredibly traumatic. Universities that teach good reading and writing but bad science, which is sometimes the case when you have religious schools, religious homeschooling thing where there's no oversight and they just teach like anti-science in some of them. There's no denying that religious teachings can inspire people, can give them hope, although I think there's a good argument to be made that quite often it's false hope. We might as well, in many cases, be having a conversation about whether or not beer has a positive influence on society. It's probably true that it does. I'm not a huge fan of beer. I'll drink a beer on occasion. There's some that I like, some that I don't. It's certainly done stuff to, make some groups tighter knit and add some fun to party, but it also contributes to alcoholism and a number of other things. For me, when I look at this, if I'm going to figure out whether or not something is a net influence, I think the best course of action is to say, okay, we have this entity, be it a hospital, a university, whatever, a community, and it is founded or based around a religious ideology. If we were to remove that religious ideology, would that university, hospital, or community be as good or better? And I think in many cases, we'd have to acknowledge that that's the case. And for a lot of religious people, their complaint when these things are raised is, and I'm not accusing Mike of this, I'm just saying that this is what happens. They will say, but that's those other religions. That's the religions that got it wrong. We've got the right one. And I don't know how we may make that determination, but I have yet to be presented with any sort of positive effect on society that can only be achieved with religion, and that couldn't potentially be achieved just as well, if not better, if we removed religion from it.
All right, excellent. I'm glad you actually brought that point up about the if we could remove religion, will we still get the positive benefits? Actually, a lot of the studies I cited do single out these variables. I mentioned intrinsic religiosity. This is actually important because a lot of these studies don't actually measure religion in society. They measure different types of religion. The three main categories you'll see in a lot of studies is extrinsic religiosity, intrinsic religiosity, and quest religion. Quest religion is just spiritual seekers. They don't really hold organized religion. Extrinsic religiosity is people who go to church or are part of a religion because they want to be part of a social group. They want the extrinsic connections. They want to just be part of a group. Intrinsic religiosity are people who are religious because they want to believe in God. They want to hold to the tenets of their religion. Just about every study I can find on this, and a lot of the studies I cited, noted these differences. They note that their benefits come from intrinsic religiosity, not extrinsic religiosity. For example, there was a study a couple of years ago which Salon tried to argue shows religion encourages racism. Well, I read the study when it came out, and I went to the tables and I looked at all the variables, and it showed that no, intrinsic religiosity decreases racism. Extrinsic religiosity is what increases racism. In fact, there was a negative correlation about 0.7 with racism and intrinsic religiosity. So when psychologists do these studies, like for example, Dr. Tony Jack, for example, they'll note they do separate out these variables. The benefits are coming from the actual intrinsic beliefs about God and their religion and whatnot. You cited the Gregory S. Paul study. You brought that up in your debate with Matt Slick, and I went and I had to find it because you didn't cite the title, but luckily I found it. And I did read that study. It's one study. It doesn't actually call in any sample sizes. It only looks at certain countries where secularism is high. It doesn't pass the normal probability plots test, which is sometimes called the fat pencil test. It only looked at general plots of nations, did not single out religiosity, and did not take other variables into account.
Plus, it doesn't really tell us what is the cause. Is it because some psychologists have kind of speculated, does first world countries with increased technology, does that actually increase secularism, or is secularism causing the benefits of society? So it doesn't actually look at that. And for example, there have been other studies. Like, for example, there was a study done in Czech Republic, Germany, Holland, Greece, Hungary, Israel, Italy, Mexico, Poland, Portugal, Spain, Switzerland, Turkey, the U.S. And it was called Values and Religiosity, a meta-analysis of studies using Schwartz model. Found across these 21 countries, a lot of the countries where the secularism is happening, that religion was positively correlated with being respectful, helpful, responsible, self-disciplined, honoring parents and elders. The correlation was 0.45. So when we do single out religiosity, even in these countries, we do see positive correlation between intrinsic religiosity. So just saying, well, we can take religion out and we still get the hospitals, we still get the positive benefits. That's actually been looked at in a lot of these studies, and it always shows that extrinsic religiosity is actually causing negative correlates to a lot of this ethical behavior and overall well-being, whereas intrinsic religiosity is what is increasing the ethical behavior.
I don't have an MD or law degree. I have a bachelor's in kicking butt and taking names.